Folks, I think at 4 minutes past, we've got a tightly packed, fun hour and a half of discussion, I hope, today. And I'd just like to welcome you to the 33rd webinar in the discussion series, Tipping Elements, the Notion of Irreversibility and Abrupt Changes in the Earth System. My name is Iain Black. I'm a Professor of Sustainable Consumption at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, and along with Amira Mukende, we're going to be moderating the webinar today. The goal of this discussion series is to advance knowledge on tipping elements and support the increasing consistency in treatment of tipping elements in the scientific community, develop a research agenda, and design joint experiments and ideas for tipping points modelling interconnection projects. Perhaps our goal today is slightly different from many of the other topics which have been very much Earth systems based, and look to conceptualise how we insert modelling the ongoing, well-resourced and antagonistic behaviour of the fossil fuel industry and its proxies in positive social tipping points. So we're going to be very much coming from, I think, a very different perspective from the sessions that have been curated so far. Just to continue, important to note that the network behind this, or the networks behind this, the Earth Commission, AMES, the Analysis, Integration and Modelling in Earth Systems Project, and both AMES and the Earth Commission are hosted by Future Earth. The Safe Landing Climate's Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Programme as well as involved. And today's event is co-organised by the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. That is, without doubt, the longest list of people who've been involved in putting on one of my seminars that I've ever been involved with. But I'm truly proud and honoured to be putting this session on together today. So just a couple of things before we move on to dampening effects on positive social tipping points and strategies to reduce them, which I promise we will make a much a more impactful title in a couple of minutes. Just a couple of housekeeping. So the speakers will present their ideas, and we've got sessions planned in between where we'd be really keen to hear your thoughts and your examples. This isn't just about, undoubtedly there'll be questions for the presenters, but we really want to get your ideas and your thoughts and as well here around about these dampening effects, these strategies and tactics that the fossil fuel industry and their proxies are using to slow progress. You know, I think when I'm speaking more broadly, often people talk about how we're failing to hit targets. We're not meeting our targets across the globe, and I put that the other way. We're not failing. We're getting beaten. I think we have to recognise that this is an antagonistic fight, and whereas many of us in here believe in social justice and a just transition to a low carbon economy, there are many people who that is an explicit threat to their worldview. And their financially privileged position. So the session that I'm just going to share my screen, share the slides now, and then work from here a little bit. There's always a done slideshow. So I'll spend just another couple of minutes talking about negative feedback loops and dampening effects. Then over to Professor Gerard Hastings to talk about industrial epidemics and to talk about some of the industrial determinants of poor health and what that we can learn then from that regarding action on climate change. We're going to have a discussion about fossil fuel industry tactics, strategies and tactics. I'll then move on to the next speaker who's not with us at the moment, but a very experienced digital campaigner. We'll talk about campaign and counter strategies, and then finally to Amira to wrap things up with a discussion around how we counter fossil fuel strategies and tactics. So just conceptually, if this is a framework used to highlight the progress that we'd like to see towards positive social tipping points or tipping human systems where there are various feedback loops, positive and negative feedback loops that move us towards this safe and just world. However, some of this tipping may come as shallower outcomes or unintended consequences. And currently it's conceptualized around this idea that there are these positive and negative balance and feedback loops that pushes further up or further down these trajectories. What I'd like to highlight in here that I think we have to add in the deliberate dampening effects of organisations and individuals who don't want us to move to for example, a food system that is reliant on or is heavily uses plant protein, or they're absolutely against us travelling by electric public transport, or transitioning an energy system away from oil and gas and coal. And at every point, as we're trying to create these positive tipping points in human systems, there are actors trying to push us back. So I wanted to bring that as a conceptualization in here. And then what we've got to do, of course, is make sure we plan for that. And that's in many ways the sort of mindset I'm trying to get across today, is that into our planning, we have to bring, rather than producing some research and some discussion from it, or some communications from it, planning over time against a well-resourced counterpart who will look to challenge and undermine what we're doing. And this is exactly why I'm going to be handing on to Gerard Hastings in a couple of minutes to talk about his huge experience in doing this over 4 decades to a large degree against the tobacco industry. So I wanted to bring that in here as conceptualization, and therefore when we're planning, we're thinking about, well, who's going to be looking to increase the dampening effects, and how do we reduce those dampening effects? So those first 3 columns are taken from the previous tipping points report, and the updated version, which will be out this year, launched at COP30. So to give an example of why I think we're on pretty solid ground to say there are deliberate dampening effects, this was something that was out by DSMOD recently. So Amrico, the Saudi Arabian national petrochemical company, they retain over 100 different marketing and communications agencies and marketing agencies to make sure that their messages are brought globally. So one organisation, over 100 agencies, including some of the largest agencies in the world. McCann Erickson, one of the largest and well-known communications agencies in the world, and yet they're so embarrassed by the work that they do with Amrico that they give them code names and put them into other parts of the building. But this is the kind of thing that we're up against. So I'd like you to maybe conceptualize today's work. And I'm not letting the sound on this one because it's from a brilliant programme called In the Thick of It, which is a political satire in the UK, but there's some wonderful swearing in it. But we're in from now on, we've got to see this as a proper fight. It's a pub fight. Now, as someone who lives quite near Motherwell, I'm not quite sure what Motherwell rules are, but it's prepared to get dirty. So I'd like to hand across now to Professor Gerard Hastings, who was my first head of department when I was at Strathclyde University. He's now Emeritus Professor at the University of Stirling, also has a role at l'École de Haute Sciences Publiques in Rennes, is the founder of the Institute of Social Marketing and an advisor to the WHO, a member of the Lancet's Obesity Commission, and has throughout his career really understood the positive, or sought to understand the positive and negative impacts of marketing on society. And I think it would be fair to say his career has had an immeasurable impact on public health through many campaigns that he's much research that he's done, but in particular around his instrumental work on ensuring there was a ban on tobacco advertising in the UK. So someone who's not only has the gravitas of a great researcher, but has gone on to create great impact, and many people are alive today who wouldn't otherwise be because of his work. So I'd like to hand across to Professor Gerard Hastings, who's going to talk to you about. We'll move on here. The industrial determinants of ill health and industrial epidemics. Gerard.
Thanks very much, Ian, and thanks for the very kind words. I was blushing. I didn't recognise myself. I think the only thing I would add is that, I think the work that I've been involved in has had a big impact, but it's not been just me doing it. It's been a team of people, and maybe that's a lesson I would think that underpins everything, that we've got to work together. This is a collective effort that is going to move the needle, rather than individuals doing things. We've got it's about working together. So yeah, as Iain said, I worked in public health, and that in that area of conflict between the interests of companies making money versus the impact on public health and public welfare, and increasingly the planet itself. So the conflict between profit and people, in Noam Chomsky's words. I wanted to start, if I get it, the next slide, Iain, just by saying a word too about economic system, because we do characterize it, and I think quite rightly too, as one dominated by massive corporations with immense power. But it's also worth remembering that for that power, they depend absolutely on us. And this is a reference back to what I think of as consumer capitalism's foundational text by Edward Bernays, in which this is written at the beginning of the last century, when mass production was just taking off. And the anxiety that's being dealt with throughout this book is the anxiety that people will not buy the stuff that is now being made. So the book is all about how we go about turning ordinary people into devout consumers. And that's our role in this system, is to buy the stuff that the factories produce. And that's both disturbing and depressing in some ways, but it also gives us a clue that we are actually immensely powerful in this, that there is something we can do, and I think that's a great start, because it as Iain was intimating, it feels pretty tough. It feels like there's a lot of progress in the wrong direction, as it were, but I think we also have to cling on to hope, and there is hope we can change things. And the simplest way of expressing that is that the entire capitalist system would be brought to its knees if we were to simply to all sit back and say, well, I am satisfied with what I now have. And these are the words that the bosses of this world would dread to hear, but the words the planet desperately needs to hear. Next slide, please, Iain. So I just wanted to share with you 4 sort of successes that I felt I'd looking back at the work we did over all those years, what emerged. I think the first and perhaps most important point is, just as the marketers have done, the commercial operators have done, we need to connect with ordinary people. We need to do that with the same professionalism. We need to understand where people are at. We need to start from where they are rather than where we would like them to be. So we've got to get inside their shoes and walk around in them, so that we understand how we can take them with us on this, what is going to be an amazing journey. And yeah, we are minnows compared to them with their multiple advertising agencies and their massive budgets. But at the same time, we have what I think of as 2 crucial advantages. First of all, we tell the truth. And secondly, the planet, Gaia, and reality are on our side, so we will win ultimately. The challenge is going to be to do that in a way that is progressive and not too chaotic. Next, so that's my first lesson. Get people on side. Sorry, Iain, next slide. You're right. Second thing, though, is that alone isn't going to shift things. You need to move upstream, and this is just checking a project that we're involved in over several decades to bring about a ban in advertising in the advertising of tobacco in the UK. And what this slide shows is how dramatic the impact that has been. And this is a survey that's gone on for a couple of decades with teenagers. And you can see in this how teenage smoking has plummeted in lockstep with their exposure to marketing. As marketing has disappeared, so their smoking has disappeared. So that now smoking has virtually disappeared amongst UK teenagers, which is an incredible step forward. And at the same time, we can see where vaping has not been controlled in the same way. The marketing of vaping products is still going fast and loose, then vaping is actually going up in this group. but smoking itself is vastly reduced. So you can make a hell of a difference by just taking away their pushing in the other direction. Next slide, Ian. Oh, sorry, I was just going to add a point in there. That bear in mind that, I'm talking about the UK here, but this has been a global move. The Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is a global treaty to combat the tobacco industry, is a fabulous model for how we could make progress on the planet. Thanks, Ian. Next. The third thing I would say, I feel this more and more passionately as our Prime Minister fails to apply this lesson, is that stories are really important. What corporations are doing is madness, and it's incredibly vulnerable to common sense analysis and taking that down by simply calling it out. And I use this example here that we, some years ago now, we got access to a massive amount of internal data, internal documents from the tobacco industry, particularly British-based firm Imperial Tobacco. And as a result of all these documents, we were able to write a detailed playbook account in the British Medical Journal, a big, important journal, beyond criticism sort of outlet. And as a result of that, there was a lot of media interest. And when the paper came out, it was a Friday it came out, and my life was, taken over by this for the day. And I came home that evening, and I was very tired. The phone rang, and it was a reporter who simply said, Professor Hastings, I believe you've published a paper today. Could you tell me what it says? A paper about the tobacco industry. Could you tell me what it? And it was clear this reporter had not even bothered to read the bloody thing. So I was it was the end of the day. I was a bit ratty, and so I just said, well, what the paper says is the tobacco industry are a bunch of bastards. And there was a long silence, and then the reporter came back and said, well, I was rather hoping you could tell us a little more than that. So I relented, and I went through the playbook, the lying, the cheating, the deliberately hiding flaws in the product, the targeting of teenagers, etc., etc. And then there was another long silence, and then the reporter came back and said, so what you're saying, Professor, is they're a bunch of bastards. And after that, there was a Daily Record had run, and they did a double-page spread of this story, a massive, massive coverage, which so incensed Imperial Tobacco that they tried to issue them with an injunction, to which the Daily Record responded in true Motherwell style, put up the middle finger, and did another double-page spread the following week. So, absolutely, when we got a story out that was resonant of ordinary people talking about what was happening in the world, the tobacco industry, despite all its power, massive legal muscle, could do nothing. So they are absolutely vulnerable to good storytelling that exposes the reality of what they're up to. Next slide, Ian. At the same time, they do have a lot of legal muscle, as we found to our cost a few years later. I arrived in the office to a letter from Clifford Chance, one of the biggest legal companies in the world, on behalf of their client, Philip Morris. Next slide, Ian. And it was demanding access to all our research with teenagers. The study I shared with you a moment ago. This was, and this they wanted all the questionnaires, all the data, all the interviews we'd done, everything. And for us, this was an existential threat. Our research centre was going to be destroyed by this, because our research had been funded by a cancer charity, and they were not going to take kindly to doing market research for Philip Morris. So we had to fight it, and we did. We fought for 2 years, but it was increasingly apparent that they had freedom of information legislation behind them, and they were going to win. And we were getting into desperate straits. We thought this, my colleague and I, Anne-Marie McIntosh, even got to the point where we chose the bridge over the Clyde from which we were going to hurl the hard disk rather than give it up to them. But it would have ruined us. We were breaking the law. We'd have probably gone to prison, and there was. But at least they wouldn't have got the data. But it would have been a Pyrrhic victory. Then a journalist rang up, Steve Connor from the Independent, And he'd heard about this battle from the Information Commissioner's website, in fact, and he said he felt it was an interesting story. And he came up from London and visited with us, and he took the measure of it and said, yeah, it's a great story. Nasty American multinational attacking Scottish children. That's going to play really well. And said, leave it with me. This was the summer. He said, when the silly season's over, I'll pick a day. My editor's on side, and we'll run with it. And sure enough, in September, he rang me up and said, okay, tomorrow's the date. And it was front page headlines in the Independent. It became the only story in the UK that day. If anybody else has had this experience, that is one hell of a turmoil to be thrown into. It's a maelstrom of every journalist in the country trying to speak to you. And that day will stay with me till the end of my life, trying to do all these interviews. And Philip Morris put up a spokesperson for the first 3 or 4 hours until the drive time show mid-morning on the BBC radio. And every time they got absolutely panned, and then they just stopped. They just went away. They went away from the media interviews, and they went away from the court case. We've never heard from them since. So again, we were able to succeed by telling a plausible story that got across the horrendous nature of what they're up to. And again, the Daily Record captured this beautifully when next slide, Iain, please. When they ran an editorial when everything had happened, the story had played, the public had been up in arms, and they finished off with an editorial with this wonderful final line in it: hell should freeze over before a cigarette company are given help to kill more of our fellow Scots. So yeah, we had connected with in the court of my learned friend, the tobacco industry was set to win, but in the court of a public opinion, they were absolutely powerless, and we need to remember that we do have power. We just need to marshal it. So yeah, it is a massive fight we have. We are the underdogs. It is a David and Goliath job, but we always have to remember that David won. And nonetheless, despite these successes, one of the markets I've been involved in, for example, is in baby milk. And there was a massive trial last year in Missouri that I was involved in against Abbott Pharmaceuticals, in which they were found guilty of having not warned people about the dangers of their product, and babies were killed. In the case, a particular baby has ended up terribly handicapped as a result of taking the formula, and they were fined $500 million, so an enormous fine for this company. But at the same time, just a few months ago, this picture appeared in the New York Times. Could you do the next slide, Iain, please? This is the chief executive of Abbott having a cozy chat in the White House with the new Secretary of State for Health, clearly well in. So despite doing the most appalling of things in their marketing and exploiting the most vulnerable of human beings on earth, they are in their posh suits in the White House, still very well connected. And that can sometimes, for us, I think, feel a little bit hopeless. How can we take on those people? But remember where I started out in this presentation, that this is about ordinary people and what ordinary people can do to overthrow autocratic and domineering, powerful bodies in society. And we should remember that we too, as the French have taught us, are well connected. Last slide, please, Iain. Thank you very much for listening. Happy to talk, take questions, or discuss as Iain sees fit. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Gerard. Thanks again for the wonderful storytelling of your career. I mean, I wonder if you could just give us a quick summary, maybe sort of 2 or 3 main takeaways about what climate activism for climate and climate change, against climate change, and towards creating positive social tipping points about the kinds of low carbon world that we want to live in. What are what are the lessons that we've got to learn from your career?
I think the ones I just ran through, I think, first of all, this has to be about ordinary people. It seems increasingly apparent to me that our leaders are too conflicted in this. They can't stand up to these massive corporations. We have a government that is desperate for economic growth. It is not going to stand up to the fossil fuel companies in that position. The only people who will force them to rethink are ordinary people. And let's not forget, at least in the UK, we live in a democracy, so that's as it should be. But it takes me back to a 15th century French writer, Michel de Montaigne's pal, who said, the rich and the powerful only have their wealth and power because we give it to them. And that we need to take it back. We need to say, no, enough is enough. We need to stop. So it's about ordinary people. It's about recognizing, I think, the insanity of the system we've now created. I think it's almost like we're pretending that isn't a problem. But perpetual growth is an impossibility. It cannot happen. No matter where the energy comes from, it is going to finish up creating problems. We need to rethink that. And that story, I think most ordinary people now, as the British courts are now showing people going to prison just for stating that very obvious fact. The fact that our leaders are becoming more draconian about this, I think, is depressing in one sense, but it's a sign that we're making a difference. We're getting somewhere. They're having to pay attention to what we are doing. And I think the third and final thing I would say is we have to retain hope. There's a great quote, which I'm going to mangle, but from a Russian emigre now living in New York. You can't have hope without taking action, and you can't take action without having hope. And I think that sums it up. And we can do these things.
Brilliant. Thanks enormously. I'm going to stop sharing now, and please would ask the audience to put questions in the chat, and we'll work through those. But also, I'd like to see a couple of questions ourselves around this, which is we'd be very keen to hear the audience's examples of the strategies and tactics that the bad faith actors in this system, in our energy system, our food system, our transport system, what tactics are they using that are essentially stopping us tipping to human systems towards low carbon, prosperous states? So if we could put those put those in the question and answer chat, that would be true, and I can read those out. So the first question we've got, just in the meantime, if you're thinking about those examples of dampening effects, the strategies and tactics, comes from Julie Milton. When the rich control the media, when the rich control the media, why don't climate activists bypass the media? Political parties door knock and leaflet to win people over. Why doesn't the climate movement do the same? Gerard, bypassing the media.
I'm not sure I would bypass it. I think we use alternative channels as well. But in the experience I've had, particularly in the case of the Philip Morris suit, it was the media saved the day. But we were doing that pro bono. That was free media. We cannot possibly compete with the example you gave, Iain, of oil petrostates with multiple media agencies churning out very professional communications. You're right in that sense, I think, Julie. But at the same time, I wouldn't abandon it altogether. I think as I said, I think we have truth on our side, and there are still, they are disappearing, I fear, but there are still journalists out there who are very interested in that and can be friends to us. But yeah, I absolutely agree. We also need to think of completely different ways of communicating. And there are wonderful examples over the years. I don't know if people are familiar with the Yes Men campaign and Bhopal, where they a couple of guys just had the sort of brilliant idea of calling a press conference, which the BBC bought as genuine, in which they said that Union Carbide were now happy to admit that it was their fault and would make restitution. And it was a completely bogus, but my goodness, it captured the media attention for a while, and indeed caused the shares in Union Carbide to dive. So we can use imaginative ways to use the conventional media as well. But yeah, I agree with you. We used to use our imagination, use every other method we can, and the Yes Men is a good example of that.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions again that, because I think can be sort of compartmentalized into, okay, if we're communicating out the way to consumers, or citizen consumers, as refer to people as, what are some of the lessons that we need to learn there? I mean, one of the things I've been frustrated through my own career is around the asymmetry, but also that we're far too rational in our approach, and our approach to the use of emotions isn't well or not calibrated or researched. There are examples of commercial organisations using MRI scanners to really make highly precise their communications out, making sure that the stimulus that they are setting out in their communications are very clearly sparking the right parts of the brain. So Gerard, I'm just wondering, the question is particularly around agriculture and food, and one of the social social systems we have to tip is the food system. How should we be communicating moving forward from meat from meat-based protein to plant-based protein?
It's a big ask, isn't it? I think I would approach this like a commercial marketer in the first instance, and I'd try and do some research with people to find out what motivates them to eat and why they do what they do. I feel we've ended up in a food market where price has become the arbiter of everything. So the way you can get things cheaper dominates everything we do, and understandable on one level, particularly in the middle of a cost of living crisis. But if we can start to get across the idea of enjoying your food rather than consuming vast quantities of it, because at the same time as we've got massive problems of people not being able to afford the food they're eating, we've clearly got a massive obesity problem. People are eating far too much, and in the words of the song, people are half the world's population is dying from eating too much, and half is dying from eating too little. And it's so that is again a sort of crazy state of affairs. I think the other thing that from my experience in tobacco, the other thing that we really have to start doing is controlling the marketing of these foods. So if we could reduce the amount of advertising for junk food, we could a whole series of controls on the marketing of that, and including the constitution of that food, so that it moves to more plant-based, it moves to lower sugar, lower salt, not by voluntary or measures, because we know that well and clear that trying to persuade people with voluntary agreements to change is never going to work, because your voluntary is never going to measure up to the share prices of Coca-Cola or whatever it is that's driving the sale. I am a very sort of virulent critic of these large companies, but at the same time we have to recognize that they are working within a system that compels them to behave in this outrageous way. So if like BP, under Looney, the previous unfortunately named CEO, tried to move to more green policies and has been pushed back because it isn't as profitable. It's not the price of the fuel isn't the problem, it's the returns you get from the investment are greater in fossil fuels. So so it's almost a case where you need robust regulation of business in order to help business to behave better, because they can't do it on their own. So it has to be upstream regulation as well. Don't know if that answers your question.
Terrific. Just in getting your experience on there. I mean, one of the other things I remember from the social marketing classes, and then the sort of career, or watching your career, was just how devious the tobacco industry was as you were trying to bring in control of their marketing. Including a story which I think I'll butcher. Maybe I'll set up and you can give an example around silk cut and a billboard. Maybe just to give an illustration of when we do something, they'll do something else. They will find the loopholes. Can I maybe set you up with the silk cut example?
Yeah, it's a really good example. That was towards the end of the last century when, as I say, government was farting around, frankly, with the sort of voluntary regulation of advertising. So they brought in a set of rules that, for example, you couldn't show people in cigarette advertisements. You couldn't say that you had to include a health warning saying that smoking was dangerous, and indeed you had to have a health warning on the pack. And in these situations, the industry just dances around it. So, for example, the health warning on if people know the brand Benson Hedges, which comes in a gold pack, the health warning was printed in 8-inch font in gold on gold, so it's virtually invisible. So they will do everything they can to avoid that sort of regulation, particularly regulation that is potentially damaging to their business interests. So trying to, and you gave the example of silk cut, that emerged because of these regulations saying you can't do the obvious thing and show lovely people smoking these cigarettes. So to get around that, they invented a whole new genre of advertising, which became known as puzzle advertising. And silk cut was a great example of that, and there were plenty of others. All the other companies were doing the same thing. And actually, there's a strong argument. And I remember a senior advertiser at the time said, be careful what you do here, because constraining a creative increases his or her creativity. You say to somebody, write a poem just with no constraint whatsoever. That's really challenging. But write a poem about a one-legged boy who scores a winner for Liverpool, suddenly you've got something to work with. So you need to be very careful of that. And the only effective way of controlling tobacco advertising was to say, no, it stops now. We need to do the same thing with with the other key public health killers like junk food and alcohol and gambling. But also on a climate level, why are we still advertising cars when we don't want people to drive? Why are we still encouraging people to use petrol when we don't want them to use petrol? We have to start thinking about this. And why on earth is flying cheaper than going by train? It's absolutely, it's insane. And I think most people would readily accept it's insane. And to take that particular example, the solution there is twofold. One is you make flying more expensive, but also you make trains cheaper so that you carry people with you. So it doesn't become a situation where only the wealthy can afford to travel in a green way, which is insane.
Thanks. We've just got a couple more minutes before we bring in Stuart Kirkpatrick to the conversation. Good to see you, Stuart. I'm looking at the various comments in the questions and answers, also in the chat, and it was interesting. I was asking for examples of what the oil and gas and oil and gas industry and their proxies are doing to dampen or to slow our progress. But people have often gone into the solutions. So we're talking. We've had examples there about different appeal types, Gerard. Instead of fear or hope, the use of drama and the importance, for example, is in the chat given to bring to public consciousness in the UK the Horizon IT scandal, which saw for people from another country and many very large numbers of postmasters, so people who ran post offices in the UK, were jailed because of faulty software that essentially accused them of fraud when it was a problem with the software that was come up with the fraud, and these people were jailed. And it had been run, this scandal had run for years. but it was only when drama was brought to it, when it became a TV programme, that into it, the government finally capitulated in the UK and started to very slowly do something about it. So this element of using drama, that we also, the point of bringing democracy, how do we put ourselves at the centre of this? It's demanding citizens' assemblies and ensuring that democracy is devolved down the way. Question also in there about the money in politics, and that takes us on to another form of marketing, of course, lobbying. In the Scottish government, unfortunately, last year the biggest single group of lobbyists were, not surprisingly, the oil and gas and fossil fuel industry. And not surprisingly, we have a climate change engagement strategy which puts at the foreground hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and large-scale wind, which is, of course, just owned by energy companies in the Scottish case, who used to be oil and gas companies, and not local communities. And then, of course, the sort of price signals. So I'm just looking down there to see if there's any more ideas on the sort of dampening effects and solutions. So Tim talking about those authentic voices and creators and influences. That reminds me of a horrible example that I heard from one of my colleagues, who did an analysis of X, Twitter before it, then X, and was been able to highlight how oil and gas companies can seed a communication. So you could get, I'm using Chevron just purely as a bad example, but it's not them specifically. Chevron make a positive statement about what they're doing for net zero, but because they know who to tag in and what words to use, when they let it free into the environment that is the social media, they will know that the right wing authentic voices that are on there will turn this message around and leave the sentiment negative. So they know how to put out positive things about the environment and end up making sure that we pull back progress because of the voices of creators and influencers like Joe Rogan. We could maybe bring into that on a different discussion. What do we do about social media? And I know that's something Amir is much more expert than I am. We can maybe bring that in just as a general issue if we've got a concern about living within this safe operating space for humanity between planetary boundaries and creating social foundations from there. How much damage is done by social media to both of in both of those areas for us to live prosperous lives. Thanks enormously, Gerard, for your time and your expertise there about bringing your career's experience of how these bad faith actors have worked against public health in this instance, but also giving us clues as they did, as the tobacco, as the oil and gas industry, the fossil fuel industry have learnt from big tobacco and have learnt from big food and have learnt from the car industry how to get round the various pressures of the industrial scale damage they cause. Give us these ideas into climate, our battle on climate change, the nature emergency, and of course into creating positive social tipping points. I'd like now to move on to a friend and a colleague in many a campaign, and it's a comrade in some ways, Stuart Kirkpatrick, who I first got to know through the Yes campaign for Scottish independence, a campaign I joined as an activist academic, purely, or in the first instance, because I thought that Scotland as an independent country could make more progress towards living within planetary boundaries. Stuart is a highly experienced digital campaigner and an activist, and we asked him today to talk about digital campaigning, but also about how to help to plan these contested campaigns. So if we're going to do one thing, how do we plan to make sure that we recognise what the opposition are likely to do and then bring that into our campaign? So Stuart, over to you.
Thank you very much, Iain, and hi everyone. I'm delighted that you're here. I'm going to talk a little bit initially about framing, then I'm going to talk about a couple of campaigns I was involved in and the lessons I learned from them. I'm also going to tap into a survey that I circulated among my networks and among the readers of the investigative news platform Open Democracy around how we view how climate is discussed. And Iain and I are doing a lot of work analysing those 2,000 responses. So initially, like framing, I hope you can see my screen. It should have a slide saying framing. And framing means talking in your terms about issues, not of those of your opponents. That means don't accept the way your opponents see and describe issues. And our opponents in climate issues are past masters at taking what is a very obvious situation, which is the activity of the oil and gas industry is threatening the habitability of our world. To put it in very stark terms, they've done a very good job in turning that on its head and presenting people who care about the climate as out-of-touch woke lefties who want to take away your car. Framing is the battleground. How people think about these issues comes before their decisions, and it influences their emotions. So here we see a picture of a frame, and it's filled with balls. And you can imagine those balls are the individual messages you'd use for different audience groups. But the framing, the way you think about an issue, the way you talk about an issue, means that it's very difficult for someone out with the frame to engage with your messaging. So we have to think about what are the bad guys doing? What are the ways in which they are talking about these issues? And how can we challenge that? How do we avoid falling into the pitfall of doing what they want us to do? I'm going to share on my screen one I think is one of the worst bits of messaging I've ever encountered in my life, and it's describing global warming in terms of a very small temperature increase. Now, proper scientists understand that 1.5 degrees of global warming is catastrophic. It's a terrifying statistic. It has appalling implications for the stability of our societies and how we live on the planet. And as that number goes up to 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees, things get pretty biblical pretty quickly. Unfortunately, to the person in the street, 1.5 degrees sounds kind of cozy. So that messaging has taken something that could genuinely affect the way that humanity lives on this planet and made it sound like kind of nice. Because I live in Edinburgh, it's cold and dreich. It'd be nice if it was 1.5 degrees warmer. And worse, we've then taken a solution and we've made our solution sound like it costs an awful lot of money and it will deliver an absolutely big nothing, net zero. So the way that we play with words and the way that they play with words are very different, because the people who talk in terms of 1.5 degrees of warming are being very responsible. They are rigorous in their fact checking, and they make sure that their statements are all strongly evidenced, as is right and proper. Unfortunately, the bad guys don't take that approach. They go for what's the most effective and impactful means of communicating about this. So we need to rethink how we talk about global warming. Whether it's about how many atom bombs, the total amount of energy pumped into the atmosphere since industrial times, what that would be if you measured it in Nagasaki's or Hiroshima's. We need to rethink how we talk about global warming, because talking in terms of what sounds like small increases doesn't work for most people, because most people are not climatologists or climate scientists. They don't get it. We need to help them get it. That is our mission. That is the battlefield. Like Iain said, I worked for the independence campaign in Scotland for 2 years during the independence referendum. Those of you who follow current events may have noticed that we did not actually become independent. We did increase support for independence by 20 points. We did, my digital campaign was described by the advisors to our opponents as the most effective social digital campaign they'd seen in Europe. But the lesson I would share from this is it's a long haul. That was 2 years talking about one thing, day in, day out, digging in, a professional team, 2 political parties, well, 3 political parties actually, if you include the Scottish Socialists, a huge number of very, very able well-intentioned activist. I'm talking tens of thousands of people in a country the size of Scotland, working day in, day out to shift public opinion. And we did not shift it enough to win the referendum. But that's what it takes. It takes digging in for a long time, and it takes the people on your side of the argument really committing. And also working hard on messaging that's going to cut through. So within Yes Scotland, there was a continual reevaluation of, right, we tried talking about this in this way, that didn't work. How do we talk about the economy, pensions, the NHS in a way that makes this make sense to people? Because communication is all about getting through to people. So be prepared to dig in, be prepared to professionalize, be prepared to mobilize very, very large numbers of people. We understood what our key audiences wanted. We focused on engaging content. It's really important. You've got about, I don't know, a second on social media to grab someone's attention. I think the optimal length for video engagement on TikTok is a 7-second video. You've got to get to the point quickly, and you've got to hammer home quickly what it means to people. We trained supporters on how to use social media. When Andy Murray won Wimbledon, I was in the basement of a hotel in Aberdeen teaching 50 people how to use hashtags. Continually briefed our supporters on our messaging. Like, I would send out 2 or 3 emails to a 6-figure mailing list every week saying, this is how we talk about health. But people then took that messaging and told their own stories about it. And like I said, we moved the dial. But we're going to have some kind of discipline, that kind of commitment, if we're going to shift the dial on climate. Because at the moment, folks, we're getting beat, and we're getting beat badly. Here's an example of something I did after Yes Scotland. I worked for 38 Degrees. There's a huge cross-community, cross-organisation campaign to get fracking banned in Scotland. This was not a Stuart Kirkpatrick win. There were hundreds of people involved, and organisations like Friends of the Earth Scotland dedicated months and months and months and months and years of work to this. But the part that I played through 38 Degrees was changing some of the framing. So we'd got to a tipping point with fracking where the SNP government had got to a place of head versus heart on it. They were kind of like emotionally, they were kind of wanting to ban fracking, but they couldn't justify it because of the economics. And this is a common thing. The environment versus economy becomes a heart versus head thing. And I thought, wait a minute, why are we accepting the framing that fracking's good for the economy? And I managed to commission some research to call into question whether, because of its impact on the cleanliness of Scotland's drinking water, there might be an implication for whisky marketing if fracking was allowed to go ahead. And we did indeed get a chap called the Master of Malts to express his worry. And from that, we were able to get lots and lots of headlines in the papers, and the SNP are a political party that pay a lot of attention to what's in the papers. And we helped shift the dial by changing that bit of framing, by not accepting that what is bad for the environment is good for the economy. And I think there's something for us there, because climate change is dreadful for the economy, and that's something that doesn't come across. We're told we can't afford net zero, but we certainly can't afford 2 degrees of warming. And the other thing I'd like to talk about is the long haul. So I used to work for Open Democracy, fantastic investigative news organization. They'd uncovered that the Johnson government, when Michael Gove was Cabinet Office Secretary, had been running a unit to block the release of sensitive information by interfering with freedom of information processes, which they should not have been doing. So this is not like the battles that Gerard was fighting. It wasn't really anyone advocating for more government secrecy, aside from this small unit in the government. We took people with us, so our framing was not about freedom of information requests, which are somewhat technical. We talked about government secrecy. So more than 130,000 people read our stories on this. We had a petition signed by nearly 50,000. We encouraged FOI experts to share their experiences through a survey and 4,000 readers to give their attitudes about government secrecy. They crowdfunded thousands of pounds for public opinion, which, surprise, surprise, found out that people don't like government secrecy and then less likely to vote for politicians who indulge in secrecy. We allowed this to feed into our journalism. We gave evidence to parliamentary inquiries. We carried a lot of public relations work around it. We also engaged in what Rudy Dutschkampf pictured would call the long march through the institutions of power. Backed by a lot of papers on Fleet Street, we got questions raised in the UK Parliament, got a key architect of the FOI Act, call for an inquiry, briefed politicians, had a court hearing ruling for us, which slammed the government for profound lack of transparency. MPs had an inquiry, we submitted evidence to it, they found we were right. We pressured the FOI watchdog. UK government launched its own inquiry into itself, which is, I think, a plot line from the thick of it. But we caused a lot of trouble, but we had a lot of help, a lot of powerful allies over a very long period of time. We took on the UK government, it insulted our journalism. Allies and readers rallied around us. We kept finding stories. We talked about it in terms that people could understand. We beat the tribunal. We beat them in inquiry. Their own inquiry vindicated us, and we moved the government watchdog, the government to get rid of this unit. But I talked about digging, and this was 2 years of maximum effort from a small organisation with help from everyone else in the government secrecy sphere, Campaign for Freedom of Information, and allies like that, all the big newspapers on our side, and it took 2 years to stop the government doing something egregious. So when you're going up against power, you've got to be patient, and you've got to dig in, you've got to take the public with you, you've got to talk to them in ways they can understand. But most of all, you've got to be prepared for a long fight, because unlike with this fight against the government secrecy unit, there are very, very powerful companies with very, very large PR and public affairs budgets pushing in the other direction. And I just want to quickly talk about some survey results that I mentioned earlier. Here you can see a word cloud of what 2,000 respondents made of the government's current response to the climate emergency. And I have to say, I doubt there's anyone on this call that's going to disagree with inadequate, pathetic, ineffective, insufficient, poor, woeful, and disappointing. But how have we got to this point whereby something that is so obviously a bad thing has generated such an abysmal response from government? And it's because we haven't talked about it in the right way, and the bad guys have lots of money to help them talk about it in a way that slows down government activity. This is a graph showing where the survey respondents are. So unsurprisingly, being readers of Open Democracy and people in my personal networks, they were towards the left of the political spectrum. We asked them, though, about what were the impact of these factors on the ability to slow down a rapid transition. And number one, powerful vested interests. Number two, political lobbying by fossil fuel companies. How do we make that unacceptable? How do we make it unacceptable for government ministers to meet oil company executives? How do we make them feel uncomfortable about it? How do we put scrutiny on that? Concentrated media ownership, that's going to be hard to do anything about in the short term. Fossil fuel and marketing and PR campaigns, again, how do we make them less effective? Dominance of GDP growth economics. We talk about economics, we talk about infinite growth as if that was anything other than a mathematical impossibility. So the public discourse around growth is not rooted in reality. How do we root it in reality? And at the end, undermining the right to protest, which absolutely is happening. And there are some terrible examples of that. And I asked our left of center friends, 2,000 of them, what were the powerful messages that they'd heard that had made their way to them through social media, through the media, against taking action on climate change. And cost and expensive is at the middle of it. And that's the clue. How do we flip that on its head and make it seem it's more costly and more expensive not to take real action on the climate emergency, because it is? Here are the messages that respondents thought were powerful, the messages from the other side. It's too expensive, it doesn't work, caring about the environment is woke. Again, transition is too expensive, we have to keep growing. fear of unemployment. Here in Scotland, this always gets bogged down in jobs in the northeast of Scotland. Then there's the anti-science argument that global warming is not due to humanity's own actions. And finally, the bottom one, I think, in these culture war times has a lot of resonance. Lefty, wokerati, eco-zealots want us to change our lives. They want to take away your car. They want to take away your hamburger. They want to take away your dram. And that kind of lifestyle stuff is very powerful. How do we counter it? So that's it from me. That's a real scamper, but happy to answer questions. Hello.
Hello. So should perhaps I start the moderate discussion so then we can get into Stuart's questions and give people some time to think as well? And yes, please add any questions that you have to the Q&A box. Thank you so much, Stuart, and also Gerard earlier for such excellent talks. They really were thought-provoking and powerful. I would like to kick us off with a question just while we wait for other people to add their questions in the chat, if that's okay. But my first question is, for both of you, what parallels do you see between the tactics or narratives used by the organizations that you have gone up against and the fossil fuel industries to delay regulation and shift public perception?
I'll jump in. This is important. The lack of priority. It's based on climate. No, we've got to worry about the economy. Growth is more important. Why does anyone care about government secrecy? We've got more important things to think about. That was one of the things that we encountered at Open Democracy, and certainly just not regarding the climate as a priority is, I think, the number one thing. So, like the hearing from ministers will be hearing from oil and gas companies or energy companies that we can't afford the just transition, or we've got magical solutions that will store carbon from the atmosphere. Just trust us. This isn't a priority. This isn't important. And I thought when they were having tried to campaign on climate, and actually, to be honest, at 38 degrees, aside from fracking, never really got our membership that interested in it. That changed with the school strikes by young people, because it was harder for government ministers to ignore children. It made them look bad. And also Extinction Rebellion suddenly made this stuff seem important. So I think the issue is one of, there are many issues, but one of the main ones is priority. It's like, go slow, this isn't important, we'll deal with this later, I've got more important things to worry about.
Yeah, I'd just jump in on that, Stuart. In tobacco, kids were incredibly important in moving the needle. I remember it was one statistic that emerged from a study that we'd done where kids had doubled their interest in point of sale display of tobacco after the industry started building up their displays. I can remember saying that statistic in the House of Commons, and the reaction of the MPs was immediate. That's outrageous, and it was just one statistic. And I think that's the second thing I would add to what you're saying. And you mentioned this in your talk, the need for a killer statistic. And 1.5 is not a killer, but the equivalent in tobacco was research showing that 1 in 2 smokers were killed by their habit, which is, nobody can say that's a good thing. You just cannot argue with that. And that is why we managed to succeed against the tobacco industry. Whereas you don't have the same killer statistics in the other areas. Plus, our antagonists have learned a lot of lessons from tobacco.
Thank you both so much. And also just to bring in an example that kind of piggybacks off of what Stuart was saying about the lack of priority. In the fashion industry, a couple years ago, we saw the launch of the Who Made My Clothes campaign that really brought to the forefront of like the cultural conversation around labor practices and factory conditions in producing clothing. Before, clothing is seen as something kind of frivolous, everyone wears it, it's not really a big deal. But through this campaign, we were able to see people's stories and see the impacts that the fashion industry was having on other people. And it really got the conversation started around labor practices. So I just wanted to bring in that example from the fashion industry.
Yeah, it's a lovely example. I was actually in Edinburgh a couple of weeks ago at the Fair Trade Conference, which was talking a lot about clothing and where it comes from, and that idea that your decisions as a consumer are not just ones about what you're going to wear and how much it costs, but they become a political movement, in fact. So the way you buy your coffee or your clothes makes a difference to how the world works. And if you can create that sense of not just shopping better, but changing the world, I think there's real power in that.
Definitely. And I just want to look in the Q&A quickly. So we have a question from Julie. And they say, according to surveys, most people are worried about climate change, but no one is coordinating them in activism. There are thousands of organizations calling for different actions, and usually those actions are weak, such as signing petitions. How do we get genuine people power going? Big numbers is our advantage against big money. So do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, I quite agree. There are more of us than there are of them, and big numbers matter more than big money. You cut to the heart of the problem. I think we don't have a killer statistic. We also don't have a killer means of delivering it. Climate organizations there are a lot of them. They are not particularly well coordinated, and I mean, collectively, including myself as an environmental campaigner, we're losing. Whatever we're doing now isn't working. We're not influencing governments around the world. We're not mobilizing people in very large numbers. I think we are guilty of having relied on what you describe as weaker tactics. So signing petition, which, I mean, here in the UK, 6 million people signed a petition to do something about Brexit, and absolutely nothing happened, which kind of shows there's an end point to that. So I do think there is a gap in the market, and I don't have the answer for something that takes people on that journey of empowerment. I don't think it's something we've seen yet. I don't think it's just stop oil. I think we need something that mobilizes very large numbers of people, that makes politicians feel in a non-threatening way personally responsible for what happens. And there are I love that Utah Phillips quote, the earth isn't dying, it's being killed, and the people killing it have names and addresses. And I don't mean that from some perspective of threatening people, but it's making people realize that what's happening is happening because individuals have made decisions. And if you can point out to individuals that they are responsible for their decisions, so, well, you will go down in history as the person who was asleep at the wheel when we could have done something about the climate emergency, and without you, insert killer statistic here. I think that begins to matter, but we're missing a bunch of tricks in the environmental movement. And there's you're quite right. The question is quite right to point out there's a big gap in the market, and we need. So basically, I think to end on a kind of slightly more decisive note, we need to rethink exactly how we're campaigning on this, because at the moment it's too fractured, it's too weak, it feels too woke, and you can get 100,000 people marching through the streets of London to spread hate, then surely to God we can mobilize far more people in a much better cause of helping keep our planet habitable.
Throw in an alternative perspective. I'm struck as you were talking, Stuart, that the progress on tobacco wasn't really made by mass movements. Yeah, people got angry about it, and people, when we had our court case with Philip Morris, there was no question that the response of the public was a big part of our success there. But by and large, the needle was moved by, in Margaret Mead's words, a small group of people being determined to change things. You think what happens with slavery? That was a small group of people that drove that forward. Yeah, the British public got involved and behind it, but you needed the group to do the planning and the sorting. And I think perhaps the biggest, I name checked this in my presentation, but the Framework Control on Tobacco Control, that was a global treaty to contain the tobacco industry. that is more, it's the most popular international treaty ever. Some 200 countries have signed up to that. Now, it's not perfect and not all countries actually implement what they've signed up to, but nonetheless, there's immense, and the most important kernel of that is that the tobacco industry should go nowhere near policymaking. Absolutely excluded from the policymaking process. And if we could replicate that success in other areas, in other markets, particularly fossil fuels, that'd be an amazing step forward. Now, the Framework Convention was masterminded by WHO. Now, I don't know who the equivalent would be in the fossil fuel domain, but it needs that sort of professional champion who knows what they are doing and can take this forward. And yeah, you need lots of public support as well. But public support without that arrowhead, if you will, is not going to get very far.
Maybe can I try if I jump in on this one, because it's very much something we've thought a lot about. So if we look at, as an academic, let's start with the research. And there's a brilliant piece by Odenweiler et al. In 2022, which examined the conditions under which we in the past we've made the sorts of industrial transformations that we need to do now. So basically went and looked at all of the products that had moved from market entry to saturation in the entire industrial revolution period, and then examined, well, what conditions caused that? What conditions were underneath, what conditions were allowed that to happen? And they found two examples. They were looking at green hydrogen as a technology, but they found two that demonstrated the rate of growth within the time available. And one of those was the Second World War arms in America and the COVID vaccines. And what that essentially, when they started to boil down the reasons for, what was it that turned countries around, turned their economies around on a dime, was essentially there was an existential threat, and there was recognized as an existential threat. So America's huge industrial might was chugging along, supporting the European allies, no doubt. But when Pearl Harbor came along, it was bombed, they shifted to the point where Ford were making B-2 bombers within 19 days. And they were churning out Liberty ships, two in every 3 days, 100-yard long cargo vessels. And the second one was COVID. So in a long way around to answer that question there is that how do we get this mobilization? Well, there is something around about existential threat that we recognize, and this tipping points conference and the grouping certainly goes into the details of that. And I notice that they've got the Amazon tipping point, an update on the October the 15th. So that brings us back round into the marketing of this. Is let's take a leaf out of their playbook, which is the use of fear. So how do we mobilize the fear of these appalling, cataclysmic, depending how much change is coming, while recognizing that language causes some people to be turned off by it, also recognizing Witt and Witt's work on the U-shaped relationship about number of fear, and I know Gerard's published more on me on this, that too much fear turns you off. But how much fear do we need to create? How do we keep it there? But the other side of this is, I think, what we really haven't done is, where's the beautiful vision that you're moving to? Yeah. Where's this sumptuous vision of the world where we don't have a monthly electricity bill to heat our houses because we've got beautifully insulated areas? We walk around wonderful cityscapes and village-scapes. We've got wonderful active transport. We've got great food. We can collaborate together around dinner, and we have purpose and practice. Where's that wonderful other life that we could get to, of which there are great examples? And I always think, Vienna always pops into my head as a place that has so many of these things. We can point to examples, but how do we bring this notion that we are in an existential threat here to us? Where is the right amount of fear? How do we keep that going? But where is this beautifully positive vision? And trying to then use that as that motivator to come back to the original question, to get us to demand action, because we demand action because we're worried about one of the, I can't remember how many hundreds of billions of dollars worth of loss that's coming the Australian real estate way in the coming years, but because we see and we felt and we've enjoyed and we can imagine the better lives that we can get to.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree, and indeed the fear and the vision are two parts of the same coin. The fear without the vision just ends up with people being in denial, because fear on its own, which you can't resolve, is going to get you nowhere. But if there's a resolution, if there's a way forward, and that's really what we need to work on. And you know, sadly the fossil fuel industry is very, very good at that. Indeed, marketing generally is very good at creating positives out of asinine consumption behavior.
Sorry to interrupt, but we do have to say goodbye to Stuart. So maybe we can just thank him for his time and expertise. And I will share Stuart's LinkedIn because I know there's a few questions about how we can learn more about digital framing and campaigning. So I will share that. But thank you very much, Stuart.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm so sorry to be ducking away, but I've got a class to teach. I'd much rather be talking to you guys. This is fascinating, very, very important stuff. So thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Stuart.
Bye.
And just to return to the chat, I see there's a question from Ted as well. And it says, I fully agree on someone's point about the illusion around unlimited GDP growth, but how do we start to highlight this to politicians and sell the wider argument when we are so embedded in an extractive capitalist system? Excuse me. So I don't know if Gerard or Iain, if you have any thoughts on this.
I try to use humour on this, but because it is at the heart. If we're listening to leverage, I used Danella Meadows' leverage points in a system as a lens that I throw upon everything. And if we're working at the mindset level and the paradigm level, and therefore at the systems goal level, it's everything. And if we get that, but recognising, I'm doing a little bit of work with a colleague at the University of Essex, that these are fetishistic beliefs that they hold. These are subjective beliefs that do not hold up to objective fact, but yet we hold on to them. So recognise as fetishistic beliefs around. So one of the ways of doing that is I try to use humour. I use the expression, we live in an era of flat earth economics, and try to bring that parody to the conversation to jerk people from this. But if I'm also listening to my Dale Schaefer Morrison, who's my psychologist colleague on this, she talks about having to build almost psychiatric interventions around this, and to treat these as malformed beliefs, but also with the recognition, I think, where we go from this, that political leaders in the UK are so tied into their identity that this isn't going to shift. So therefore, it brings us into the question about, well, if the current politics isn't capable, how do we build a new politics? And I know in the UK, there's disillusion. We've got the right-wing Reform Party tapping into all of the same, the issues of decent housing, decent food, decent opportunity that the left used to be able to produce. So they've created their new party. Jeremy Corbyn, an unsuccessful left-wing candidate in the UK, has tried to bring his new party to the fore in their discussions in Scotland. So I think around there we have this, can we use humour? What sort of interventions do we need to recognise how damaging and subjective this belief is? I mean, we can direct them to the work of Herbal or the 835 paper meta-analysis demonstrating that green growth isn't possible. We can do all of those things, but ultimately we've got some identity issues. And if that thing fails, we come back to, well, if our politics and our politicians are failing and they're reproducing failing politicians into the parties, then maybe we need to start some new parties.
Yeah, and I don't think you'd have a problem selling that message, Iain. I think there's a great deal of disillusion at the moment in but the other thing I would add to that, Amir, going back to our conversation about fast fashion, is that in our consumption behavior, we are driving the system from the bottom, just as the companies are driving it from the top. Going back to Edward Bernays, this system doesn't work unless we consume like idiots all the time. And if we begin to get a control on that ourselves and tell the story of that, so, like the fair trade movement, which we think of as, maybe no more than buying fair trade coffee once in a while. But we start to think of that as a movement where your purchase of a coffee has a direct impact on the community in Africa where they grow the coffee, and they get a premium because you've bought it through the fair trade movement. They can therefore build schools and hospitals. You get to know the people who are doing exactly that and benefiting from that. Then you suddenly start to create a world that is a bit like the sunlit uplands that Iain was name checking a moment ago. A vision where, actually what we do isn't condemn people to work in a sweatshop, but by our consumption behavior, we actually make the world for them a better place and for us a better place at the same time. And it's a conversion of individual bits of behavior into something much more like a social movement, which is changing the world as we go along.
You've got Gerard.
Okay, yes. Oh, yes, but thank you. That's really insightful answers. Now, I think we have time for maybe one more question. And I see there's a question here from Robin, and it's asking about how can people get better at framing and digital campaigning? How can we gain these skills? Now, one thing I will do is I just want to put in the chat Stuart's LinkedIn, because he did say if you want to know more about this, to message him on LinkedIn or connect with him there. But I'll be curious to hear if you have any thoughts, Gerard and Iain.
Ooh, Iain, you go first. Well, I'll jump in at the moment. I think I'm not convinced that social media communication is any different from any other sort of communication, which is that you've got to see the world as your audience sees it and understand what they are doing, and you can only hone your messages by listening to them and getting their response to them, and work out thereby what really does get people interested and excited, and what confuses and does the reverse. So I'm not sure. I'm no expert in social media, but I think the basic principles of communication remain the same. There's a very good reason why we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth.
Yes, I completely agree with you about telling stories and just connecting with people as people. And also, maybe you can look at some opportunities, perhaps through your local library or through charities that are local to you. Sometimes they offer training in exactly this type of area. And that can also be a really nice way to connect with other people near you that are having the same goals. Since we're all always so fragmented, you can connect with people around. That being said, I think we have to wrap up now because we're approaching 3:30 or 4:30, depending on where you are in the world. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers today. Maybe we can give a round of applause on Zoom, just to thank them for their excellent presentations and their insightful answers to our questions. And thank all of you for participating and asking great questions. We really appreciate it. More events will be announced soon, and I believe Caroline has put a link to the Tipping Points website. And yes, I believe that is us. So thank you all very much. And perhaps you can connect with us on LinkedIn if you would like to continue the conversation.